Hey, gentlemen, I'm going to have to get underway. They're cutting us a little short today because of the counseling A, B, C, D. I'm used to the rock and roll days of AC/DC, so I have to be careful. So they're having the counseling class in this room, and so I'm going to have to cut us a little short today. So I wanted to get into what we have so that we could perhaps finish sheet number 1 on the Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 21, the ingredients for an uncompromising life. And let me just kind of lead us in some prayer, and then we'll just dig right in because there's so many things to cover here. So let's do that. Well, Heavenly Father, we come before you today as men who desire to understand what you have revealed to us and to comprehend it in such a way that it's ready for the application of truth to our life. That's the real ambition for our men's study on Saturday, is to take what we learn and bring it to bear in our lives so that you are glorified by the conduct of our life. And so I pray for my brothers that their hearts would be open for the implanting of truth. I pray that you might grant to me the capacity to speak with clarity and to assist in some way a greater comprehension of what we look at. And so I pray these things in Jesus' name, amen.
Pastor Daniel's an easy book. You ought to be able to.
Oh, yeah, it's very. That's one of the things I found to be very easy. Yeah. Yeah, especially chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12.
You
Yeah.
should breeze right through those.
Sorry, those are real quick. Yeah.
Sure, you have 7.5 years.
Yeah, I got 7.5 years to cover it. So, hey, when we look at Daniel chapter 1 last week, the first thing we noticed in verses 1 and 2 is the conquest. Remember that? We talked about the prophets of old, including Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah. All of these prophets told the people of Israel that if they chose to live in disobedience to God, if they decided that they would be indifferent to his mandates, and that they would get involved in idolatry and immorality, that God promised he would take them out of the land and they would be gone into captivity. We learned that. And so what we are learning in verses 1 and 2 is the very first siege of the fulfillment of that prophecy when Nebuchadnezzar comes to take the people out of the promised land. This happened in 605 BC. There are 2 other sieges that would follow, but this was the one in which Daniel and his friends were taken into captivity. So look at that verse 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. And remember, we told you that that word Lord there in verses 2 is very critical because it's not the typical word that you might find in the Hebrew. It's the word Adonai. And remember, we said that word means the sovereign one, the one who has the right to reign. So this victory that Nebuchadnezzar experienced over Judah was divinely directed. In other words, the victory wasn't because of his great military expertise. This was part of God's plan for his punishment of Israel, Judah in particular, the southern kingdom, because this is what God told them would happen if they would disobey him. And they did. I mean, they radically disobeyed him. At the time, in 605 BC, when this happened, they actually had idols in the temple. That's how bad. In God's temple, they had set up idols. And so, they were far from obeying the mandates of God. And so this besieging of Judah was well-deserved in their part. And the other thing I wanted you to notice is, remember when Nebuchadnezzar won this victory, he took the articles, especially the gold and the copper and the cups and such, and he brought them to Shinar, the capital of Babylon, and he brought them into his god, Bel of Marduk, and he put those articles in the temple of his god. And he did that intentionally and purposefully because he was sending the message to Judah that your God could not stop me. My God is greater than yours. Now that's ridiculous. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar is going to learn the lesson about the sovereignty of God. We're going to get to that chapter, and we'll see where he learns finally, no, this is all a part of God's divine plan. So we looked at those first two verses, and we noticed that. And the second thing on your notes there on page 3, we noticed the command in verses 3 through 5. This is what we did last week, so I'm just summarizing it quickly. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and the nobles. Youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability in serving the king in the king's court. And he ordered them to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. So the order was to take some of the nobles, some of the children of the royal family in Judah. And historians, Hebrew historians, tell us about maybe 70 of these young people were taken. They were all related in some way to the kings of Judah. And in that 70, there were the 4 specific ones that are highlighted in chapters 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and all the way up to 6. And that's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those 4 were highlighted especially. And we're going to learn that in spite of their effort to culturalize them, the aim of this movement on the part of Nebuchadnezzar was to take these 4 young men, all of those young men, and to make them into Babylonians. Because in this way, he was heading off a future rebellion. He had the best leaders they could ever have, the youth of their day, and he was turning them into Babylonians. So he's teaching them the culture, he's teaching them the language, and we learned about that the last time as well. And then the third thing we learned, if you looked at your notes on page 4, is we started to understand about who these captives were. So we looked at the conquest, we looked at the command, we looked at the captives. And if you look in verses 6 and 7, it said, among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. And to Daniel he assigned the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. All of those name changes were also intentional. Everything here is intentional. The reason that they were changing their names is because all of their names said something about the character or the works of Jehovah God. So he changed them to reflect the names of their gods so that they would understand, again, their gods are greater than your gods. So it's very important, yeah.
And back in verse 2 where it says, along with some of the articles from the temple of God, and in Isaiah where it says nothing will be left.
Yeah.
Is the nothing will be left talking about the destruction of the buildings?
The third siege.
Okay.
The third siege, yeah. The first siege, he took just some of the articles. The final siege, yeah, everything is gone. Matter of fact, the temple is destroyed. In the third siege, the walls are broken down. Jerusalem is completely unpopulated. There's nobody in it. It's just completely destroyed. And that's for another time. We'll cover that one. Okay, so having changed their names, there was one problem that we highlighted, that these faithful Jewish young men would have a problem, and that is over there in verse 5, the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank. And he appointed that they should be educated 3 years, and at the end of which they would enter the king's personal service. This is the only big major problem that these Jewish boys would have. And it's for 2 reasons. Number one, a lot of the food that was consumed by the Babylonians did not meet the regulations of Leviticus chapter 11. They were not kosher food. They would eat pork. They would even eat horse flesh in Babylon. So it would be in a violation of that standard. Second of all, the food that before it was presented to the king in his royal court would frequently first be offered to a pagan god. So if they ate that food, they felt like they would be engaging in that same worship of a pagan god. So this is where they were going to draw the line. And by the way, let me just tell you this. If compromising and disobeying God's standards got them into this problem, what is the one thing they don't want to do now that they're in the problem? In other words, if disobeying God got you to this horrible circumstance, the worst choice you can make is, well, we're just going to continue to disobey him. We're going to dig the hole deeper, you know. We're going to make trouble even more so, yeah.
Do you think they actually understood why they were there?
Yeah, I think they probably did. I'll say that because as I look at the character of Daniel and these young men, somebody invested in them, probably their parents, and they probably taught them the Word of God. I think that they're a classic example of sometimes when God brought judgment on an unrighteous nation, the righteous people in that nation suffered as well. You get that?
I think we know what that means.
Yeah, we know that part. Kind of from experience, yeah. But that's the problem here. You know, God did bring this horrible judgment, and I think these are fine, very fine young men. And I think the reason that God had the Holy Spirit give the inspiration of the writing of this book was to encourage Israel in their captivity and to give them lessons. Now, here's a major lesson. You need to follow the example of these 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, who at this time made that decision. You need to follow their example. If you're going to be in captivity, don't make your captivity worse than it is by your disobedience, you see. Yeah, yeah.
How does modern day prosperity preaching take hold of this?
I don't know how they take hold of this because it can't be found anywhere at all. I don't know about you, but I caught this thing on television. It was doing a documentary on Hillsong ministry. Oh, man. There was a lot of corruption going on in that thing before it caved in. And that's usually what happens, you know. But anyways, the prosperity guy, I don't know how they would deal with this matter. So, knowing that this is going to be a problem, what we're going to look at today is the courage on your outline. The courage of page 5, courage of convictions. And we're going to start to learn from this behavior the ingredients of an uncompromising life. We're going to start to see that unfold. And this is what we want to learn in these first 3 or 4 chapters, is what does it take to be an uncompromising person who's in the midst of a fallen world and often under very ungodly governments? How do we function? How do we act? I mean, these young men were under a very ungodly, pagan to the core. If you think there's anything bad about our government, the government of Nebuchadnezzar was horrific. And same thing with the Romans. They were horrific. You know, if you study the Roman government. But anyways, the point is, how do you remain faithful to God in that context? And that's the lessons that we want to get from this. So the courage of their convictions, these 14, 15-year-olds. Take a look at verse 8. It says, but Daniel made up his mind. One translation says he set his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now that's very, very interesting, even the way he handled it. take a look at your notes because I want you to see this. On page 5, under the courage of convictions, this verse reveals to us that this determination, conviction, or resolve to remain faithful to God's will was firmly established in the past prior to entering the tempting situation. Made up his mind, or as some translations have it, set his heart, conveys the idea of a mindset prearranged before facing the tempting situation. The verb tense is strongly in favor of that understanding. It means that he made a decision in the past. It's almost like the perfect tense in the Greek. The perfect tense describes an action that took place in the past but has a lingering result. So this action was somewhere in the past. Daniel resolved, he committed himself that in the going into captivity, when he made the commitment, he didn't know that this would be the first test. Do you understand that? He wasn't aware of what the test would be. And I can understand that we're going to learn these are very intelligent young guys who were gifted with intelligence and wisdom from God. So he understood that you don't want to add to the troubles of the captivity by your disobedience. So he already resolved in his heart, already developed a conviction, a standard that as I go into this circumstance with its temptations, I will always, always draw the line for my life where God draws the line. That's what he did. Now again, I'm talking about a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old. It's important that we keep that in mind. He drew the line there. I'm not going to do this. Now you go on, in that little box there is your idea of what it means to be uncompromising. It is a predetermined commitment or a resolve of the heart to remain faithful to God's will, regardless of the circumstances or the consequences of your obedience. So this is a steadfast commitment. By the way, this particular principle is exceedingly helpful for you and I in dealing with temptations. That you make the decision as to what you're going to do in a given temptation based upon what God says you should do before the event occurs. So you're already ready, if you get it that way. You know what you're going to do if this thing happens as it did in their case. So Daniel had already drawn the line where God had drawn the line. Now notice it says under the box, this is the first ingredient of an uncompromising life. And this ingredient is modeled for us by Daniel and his 3 friends who would not morally or ceremonially defile themselves with the king's choice food or wine. They would violate God's standards. There would be defilement. They would be unclean in the presence of God, according to what God's word says about what you should eat and what you should drink. And so they would not do it. And they made that decision before. And that's very important. You get that. They made that decision before. Some people believe that Jonathan Edwards, who wrote 70 resolutions that would guide his life when he was about 18 or 19 years old, he wrote that famous, the resolutions for his life. And they believed that he was inspired by this, by that principle. That he would know, he'd put it on paper, he'd put it in writing, this is what I will do. So it helps you. It doesn't guarantee that you'll always be victorious in the temptation, but it helps you to know exactly what you're going to do. You're not scrambling in the moment, in the intensity of the temptation. You know, this is what I'll do. I will do this. You understand that? Yeah, Bob.
Everything we're talking about is how not to be conformed to the world.
Yeah.
And so basically, he did here is doing what he says in Romans 12, 1 and 2.
Sure. Yeah. He was not conforming. He was not conforming. There's another principle going to emerge here that's really relevant to you and I. We're going to get to that in a minute. But yeah, that's exactly what he was doing. He was living out the intention of why God chose the Israelites. What's the intention? What did he want from Israel? He only selected those people. Why? He wanted them to be set apart from all the other nations round and about them. He did not want them to be involved in idolatry. He did not want them involved in the immorality. He did not want them involved in the power grabs and the deception and the murder and all the other stuff that went on in these fallen places. He has the very same standard for you and I. That's why Jesus said, listen, you're in the world, not of it. And he said, you know why the world hates you? He said in John 15, because I chose you out from the world. And he says in James, don't befriend the world. If you become a friend of the world, you become an enemy of God. Or Romans 12:2, don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. So all of that is a part of, the same kind of commitment that you and I have to do. I'm going to turn down Lake of Fire, if you don't mind.
Watch out, you might die.
Yeah, I know.
Not too much, because it's like comfortable.
Now the reason I can control the heat is my name is written in the book of life. So I was able to turn it down like that. Yeah. Did you have something? Oh, okay. All right. So let's go back to the notes. Under mentioning Jonathan Edwards, the next paragraph, it said, this is a wonderful strategy for winning the battle of temptation. Before you're placed into the context of temptation, you must already predetermine your response. And that determination must be reflective of the will of God in the Word of God. That's very much akin to what we learned in Galatians 5:16. Walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. Order your behavior by that which the Spirit has inspired and given to you in His written revelation, and you won't carry them out. Because if you're committed to doing the will of God, then that's what's going to happen. You get that? It's so important that you get it. Next paragraph. In order to avoid defilement, the young Jewish captives asked the chief official, Aspenaz, if he might be served a substitute, they might be served, or he might be served a substitute diet. In making this request, Daniel was polite and tactful. Believers today may disagree with official policies and even with each other, but they should follow Daniel's example in disagreeing in an agreeable fashion. He disagreed with it, but he was not disagreeable. He was not making a bad situation worse by his own bad attitude. Sometimes we do that. We make a bad situation worse by our own bad attitude we bring to it. And so he's requesting at first, and he's talking to Ashpenaz. And Ashpenaz is the guy that was given the official charge of Nebuchadnezzar to take care of these boys and to give them the best food that the king eats and drink the best wine that the king drinks. And this young whippersnapper is saying, I'm not going to defile myself with this particular stuff, you see. Now, there's a list here that I have of reasons why they could have compromised. There's a list in the bottom of the page 5 there. Why could they have compromised? Well, they were young teenagers, 14 to 17 years old, and many people assume that immaturity will quickly overwhelm one's ethical standards. So in other words, did they have the maturity level at that point to do it? Well, we're going to learn later that they were especially endowed with wisdom and knowledge from God. I'm sure that added to it. But they obviously did have the maturity enough to draw the line for their life where God drew the line. Number 2, they were away from home. Who was going to know if they stepped beyond God's will? Well, God always knows, but their parents wouldn't know. I mean, they were taken out of the land that they were raised in. 3, they were captured. They were slaves under the rule of a malevolent authority. They could have lost their life. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't going to say, well, let's sit down and reason together. He would have said, why don't you chop off all their heads, hang them on a pole as an example to the others. I mean, he was a pretty harsh man, so he could have done that. Number 4, if they desire to improve their lot in this new situation, compromise might be the quickest means. However, we're going to learn from the life of Daniel later on when he's 80 years old that he was able to advance in a secular, hostile government without ever compromising. I mean, he had 2 different kings that wanted to place him in a very exalted position. The Babylonian king as well as the Medo-Persian king. There was something special about this guy, and they wanted to advance him. When we get to that 6th chapter, you'll see that when he's been in service for 66 years. He's been in political jobs 66 years. He's about 80 years old. And the new Medo-Persian king wants to make him essentially the prime minister over the land. And his enemies, we're going to learn, set out opposition research against him. You heard that before, opposition? Is that the first time you've ever heard? How many heard that the first time? No. Yeah. Opposition research to examine the 66 years because they wanted to find dirt so that they could get him from not being the prime minister. They didn't want that nomination to go through. And I don't know why this sounds so familiar to me. I don't know. But they looked at 66 years and they found absolutely nothing. No cheating, no tax evasion, none of those kind of things. None of that thing they found in this guy's life. And so he's a very principled man. We'll get to that when we study that. All right, number 5. All of them could have been killed for insubordination, just like that. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar, again, is not going to just necessarily say, oh, I'm sorry. Let's see if we can order some kosher food for them. No, snuff them out. Number 6, because, again, Nebuchadnezzar is saying, what is your problem? I'm trying to give you the best food that I eat and the best wine that I drink. What's your issue? You see. So number 6, they could have reasoned that it was God's fault that they were in this situation. So why should they obey God now? A lot of people do that when they find themselves in a terrible circumstance. Well, if God was really sovereign, if God really loved me, he wouldn't let me go through this thing. And so now I'm angry with him and I'm not necessarily willing to obey him. No, they didn't do that. It's an amazing thing. Number 7, they could have compromised because they were raised in a society of compromise. That's what brought about the captivity. What did they see modeled for them continuously in their culture? So obviously they had to stand out even in their own culture, because of the fact that everybody else was compromising and doing whatever they do, and they did not. Number 8, they were not commanding them to kill someone, steal from someone, or to commit fornication. In other words, as you look at the list of the commands, they're not a part of the big ones. They weren't saying, we want you to sleep with these Babylonian women. They were not saying, we want you to kill these disobedient servants or whatever. All they're saying is, listen, we want you to eat the food and drink the best wine that we have in Babylon. And they didn't do it. So all they wanted to do them to do is eat that food. So Daniel goes first to Ashpenaz. And Ashpenaz, and this is the next part of your outline, the commander's reluctance. Ashpenaz is reluctant to let them only have, he's going to make the suggestion, just give us vegetables and water. And, we promise you, we're going to look better than the others, And so take a look at the commander's reluctance. Verse 9. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. Once again, we see the sovereignty of God working in the heart of Ashpenaz. Ashpenaz is fond of this young man and probably his 3 friends as well. He's fond of him Matter of fact, it says that word favor is the Hebrew word hased. If you look in that second paragraph under the commander's reluctance, hased in this context suggests goodwill, compassion. It conveys the idea of tender feelings. Ashpenaz had generally grown to admire and feel an attraction toward these Jewish captives. God's common grace, which operates in the hearts of unbelievers, is exemplified here. This is God working in the heart of the... Reminds me of the Proverbs 21:1. I got it listed there for you. The king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. So this is a part of God assisting this whole thing from becoming an example to all the other Jewish people of how you should conduct yourself under the captivity. Let's take a look at verse 10. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youth who are your own age? Then you will make me forfeit my head to the king. Hey, if I let you do this and it doesn't work, guess who gets the big deal out of that? Me. So I can't do this. There's no way. You're going to have to eat the food. So now Daniel approaches another guy who Ashpenaz assigned it over him, and he's called an overseer or a commander. Take a look at verse 11. But Daniel said to the overseer, that's not Ashpenaz, that's the guy who Ashpenaz appointed to oversee them in particular. And he said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, please test your servants, now look at this, for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. So all we're asking for is 10 days. Just let us run this test to show you. And fortunately, that seemed like a favorable test. When they talked to Ashpenaz, he was thinking, there was not a 10-day test. Just don't give us any of that food. Let us have vegetables and water. This is now, I think in the wisdom of Daniel, they understood, look, we could show them this in 10 days. So he approached him and he said, can we do that? Verse 12, please test your servants for 10 days and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Deal with us according to the results of the test. And look at verse 14. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. Ha! Finally, take a look at some of your notes there. On verses 11 through 13, the note says, when Daniel's request seemed to have been denied by the chief official, Daniel approached the guard or the overseer from whom Ashpenaz placed over the 4 youths and requested a 10-day trial period in which Daniel and his companions would be given only vegetables and water. Verse 14 says the overseer consented and allowed the test, and this would have provided cover for Ashpenaz or the overseer in case the test failed. This indicates that God intervenes on behalf of those who trust him, and he protects and preserves those who obey him, even under pagan rule. That's another reason why I don't want to compromise, because here, I'm going to give you the second one in advance. The first one we already learned, that you predetermine your mindset to draw the line for your life where God draws the line. The second one is you trust your sovereign God for the outcome of your obedience. You trust your sovereign God for the outcome of your obedience. In other words, you don't trust the circumstance or the situation, but you trust God. If I obey him, I'm just going to allow him to deal with the circumstance. And that's exactly what went on here. You'll see it again in some other scenarios as we look. Turn to page 7 now. So what was the conclusion of this whole matter? It's very interesting to me. Verse 15, it says, at the end of the 10 days, their appearance seemed better. They were fatter than all the youths who have been eating the king's choice food. I used this one on Cindy when Cindy told me about that I could lose a lot of weight if I eat vegetables and stuff. And I said, no, the Bible says that you could, in 10 days, you'll be fatter.
In 2 weeks, try it.
She didn't buy it, but I tried to maneuver this passage, she did think, she's a wise woman, she did say, well, the sovereignty of God's involved in that circumstance and not in yours. It's your own.
Somebody told me that, I said, I'll eat the vegetables, but smother it in gravy
Yeah.
and,
Bacon.
yeah, and stuff it with bacon. Right.
Well, she said, what's your favorite vegetable? And I said, French fries. So that's not what it is. So. Verse 16, so the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and wine that they were to drink, and he kept giving them vegetables. So now the overseer is saying, hey, this is a good result. Let's exceed the 10 days. Let's continue it on. This is good. And then verse 17, as for the 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. In your notes on page 7, look at the note on verse 17. It says, all 4 youths, or page 7, yeah, verse 17. All 4 youths were granted remarkable intellectual abilities. However, the author emphasizes that Daniel had a unique gift that set him apart from the others. Daniel was miraculously endowed with a highly valued ability in that era, particularly in Babylon, the talent of to interpret visions and various visions and dreams, which you will see him doing in the 2nd chapter of this book. The next chapter, you'll see that happening. This ability would bring Daniel and his friends to a position of being highly favored by the king. Because in the 2nd chapter, you're going to learn that Nebuchadnezzar has this very, very troubling dream and vision, and he would not tell his magicians and conjurers the details. He said, no, you tell me what it meant. I had this vision. So basically, I had a vision, tell me what it meant. And they were lost from what to do. But Daniel gives the Nebuchadnezzar the details of the vision. This is what you saw, and this is what it means. And that all came from God. We'll see that when we get into the next chapter. Under that 17, the paragraph, it says, the fact that God gave Daniel the ability to understand and interpret visions and dreams meant that throughout Nebuchadnezzar's long reign, he depended on Daniel for understanding future events revealed through dreams and visions. And he did. If he had one, he turned to Daniel. As a matter of fact, Daniel turned out to be far better than any of the other guys. If you take a look now at verse 18, it says, then at the end of the 10 days, the king had specified, or at the end of the days, I shouldn't say 10, that'd be 3 years. At the end of the days at which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. So the 3 years are over. And the king talked with them, that would be Daniel and his friends. And out of them all, no one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the conjurers who are in all his realm. All of that, gentlemen, is done by the sovereign hand of God. He was going to use these young men as a model. All right, you're in captivity. You don't want to make it worse. Follow their pattern. These individuals had committed to obey God's law no matter the circumstance they encountered. These individuals trusted me with the outcome of their obedience. You're going to really see that in the 3rd chapter. The 3 of them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are put through a severe test in which they would have to obey God at the certainty, at least in that for a moment of time, the certainty of loss of life. and in the most vicious manner that the king could conceive. So we'll see that as well. That's another testimony of how you live an uncompromising life. And there are brothers and our sisters in the world that are doing this all the time, that second principle. They're trusting God with the obedience and leaving the consequence of their obedience in the hands of God. And sometimes it costs them their life. But this here is directly divine, by divine design, God is directing. And then verse 21 says, and Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. He continued until the fall of Babylon. And then he started to work in the administration of Cyrus the king, which you get into the 6th chapter. So that's a period of 66 years, gentlemen. 66 years. And by the way, Nebuchadnezzar's son, on the final day of the Babylonian Empire, was throwing a feast, you might remember. And he went and he got the articles from the temple, the chalices and all of the things, and he was defiling them, drinking, getting drunk. And that was the final day of the Babylonian world empire. That's the day they were conquered by the Medes and the Persians. Very interesting to me. So who's God's greater? The God who arranged that whole deal. Now there's one other principle, and we'll get to this in the practical implication. One other principle that I want to give you I don't have written out, but it's here nonetheless. When a government authority leaves its lane, you must submit to a higher authority, no matter the consequence. Let me say it again. When a government authority leaves its lane, you must submit to a higher authority, no matter the consequences. Now, what I mean by leaving its lane is that if you look at Romans chapter 14, is it 14, where it says that 13, God gave authority to human government. And the reason he gave the authority, the purpose of authority to human government, was to punish evildoers and praise those who do good. So law and order, organization, a culture that would be so under control. For example, Christians could go with the gospel in that culture unhindered and so forth. So God said, listen, here's government, here's your delegation. And that's their lane. In the family, he said, the husband is the one who has headship. And he has a lane. It's for his family. The father cannot say, we're not going to pay taxes, because he's left his lane of authority. You get that? That belongs to the government. God gave that to the government, so he has to stay within his lane. Now, the government should stay in its lane, not intrude into his family and say, if your daughters want to have their genitals changed, let them do it without your permission. They can't do that either, because they're leaving their lane. Do you understand that? The church has an authority, which is mediated through the plurality of godly men, the elders, and they have a lane they must stay in. The church cannot make mandates for the government. Do you understand? The church can't make mandates. However, if the government leaves its lane and makes a mandate for the believers have to submit to a higher authority, and that authority would be God. And this is what you're going to see, especially when we get to the 3rd chapter with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The government law was that everybody in the entire kingdom had to worship this idol that Nebuchadnezzar created. And those young men stood their ground. They held their ground, because at that point, the government left its lane. You get that? That was the issue MacArthur had with Los Angeles. He said, you can't tell the church it can't worship. You've left your lane. You see, you have certain authority, but you can't tell the church that. You see, so this is what you're going to see here in an uncompromising life. You're going to see the same thing in the 6th chapter. When government creates a law that nobody can pray to any other god other than the emperor of the Medo-Persian government. That was a 30-day law, you see. Yeah.
I was gonna say a good modern day example is same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
The government's not the church.
Yeah.
The government can do what they want.
Yeah.
The government sanctions that.
Yeah.
Yet if a same-sex couple came in here and said, Pastor Jerry, would you marry us? You would say,
No.
no. And from that standpoint, it's not enough for them to have that.
Yeah.
They want to force that upon you.
Yeah. Yeah. So the point,
Yeah, just real quick.
Yeah.
You can see this around the country where this poor cake maker in Colorado has
Yeah.
been sued about 5 or 6 times. And they always lose, but they don't care. All they're trying to do is punish him.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, go ahead.
No, and that's where I'm just saying that's our standard. Government tells me you do 55 miles an hour, I do 55 miles an hour.
You
Yes. Yes.
I actually do 57.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard that rumor that they allow you 5 miles over. Remember, I was raised in Chicago. They'd pull you over because you were doing 3 miles less, but no, you do what they tell you to do unless the government tells you to disobey God's standards. So even in drawing the line for our life, we have to say, if a government official mandates me or you or all of us to do something that's contrary to God's standard, then we must obey a higher authority. And that higher authority is God's authority. And that higher authority is staying in our lane. If we don't, again, I don't have, as a pastor, I have no governmental authority. Matter of fact, I have really very little authority over you other than the ones that God gives me. In other words, the authority in the church. If you decide to live in sin, then I have to follow what Jesus said I should do when you live in sin, you see. And that's why government has a very hard time suing a church that practices church discipline. Because what are they doing? They're obeying a higher authority and how to deal with the matter of sin in the church. And so in Missouri, that's nearly impossible. That's because we have a conservative government. Probably in LA, you could still sue, but in Missouri, it's nearly impossible because Missouri wants to protect or stay away from or stay in its lane most of the time. So now, who knows if that'll change, but that's the way it is.
Jerry, real quick, your example, the 55 mile an hour and
Yeah.
the 65.
Pardon me?
We're in a relativistic world.
I am.
Well, your mile is different than my mile, but that's okay.
Well, I told the policeman when he stopped me, that's your truth. I have my truth.
Oh, my gosh.
How much did it cost to get you out of there?
We don't want to talk about that part.
Now, I guess I don't have a good clean thought on this, but like, they had this issue up in, I think, Detroit, where they had the Muslim community had their, Shahara law.
Yeah, sure.
There the government stepped in and said, no, you can't cut the head off of this person
Yeah.
because they did this. I don't know, are they
They exceeded, their whole religion, their religion is based on a caliphate. It's that their religion should rule over government. And they were trying to practice that here in the United States. In the United States, we say, no, they're separate, government and church, and you can't, in your church or your religion, make a law and force it upon us. So they were trying to do that, and of course our government, being what it is, said, no, you can't do that.
That's why if you go to another country and that's their setup,
Yeah,
that's why this happens.
it's exactly right, yeah,
I mean, they go, we don't care about your government,
yeah.
ours is this way, and you're done.
A perfect example of that is Iran.
Yes.
Iran's government and religion are one and the same. And that's the danger of that. Because God gave a separate authority to his church. And they have to stay in their lane. And he gave a separate authority to government. They have to stay in their lane. And so you can't blend them.
The US is just sort of different that way, and they
Yeah.
don't take a plethora as long as you don't exceed this sort of,
Yeah,
and ultimately the reference that they used was a Christian sort of basis.
yeah, yeah. Guys, guess what? I promised those people that we would get out of here. And so, listen, you have to vacate it pretty quick because the class is going to start here at 8:30.
Just real quick, you guys, if you ordered a creation calendar, they'll be here on Saturday the 20th, and if you're not here, I'll have it at church on the 21st. If anybody's still interested in one, there's a sheet on the table over there. Thanks, Pastor.
All right. Thanks, guys, for putting up with our changes here. I have so much more to tell you, but I can't.
And what I'm about to speak to was something that